thank you everybody for being here today. I've just had so much fun in this past half hour as people have walked in the room, and I'm seeing so many different walks of life, times of my history here at CU Boulder, people I haven't met before, but I'm really thankful that you're here for the conversation we'll have. Where are we at in time? Over the next sort of 45 minutes or so, talking about this area of hydrogen and why we're continuing to be very interested in what hydrogen's role could be in society and in providing things like clean energy sources, what's the real potential of that, but what is the foundational science that we're using to try and investigate both modern energy systems or how just basic life functions on our planet. So that's sort of the discussion that we're going to have today. And I'm just completed 20 years here at CU, so I'm very proud to have been a professor in the Department of Geological Sciences, in the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's really amazing how fast time flies, and it's really by watching my children grow up through that time that I can recognize that it's gone by in the blink of an eye. So today, I'm only going to get to tell threads of a story trying to connect on the foundation of work that's been done by so many different colleagues and collaborators that I've worked with. And what I hope you'll see with the images here is that most of them are early career scientists. Really had the great pleasure to work with many undergraduate, graduate students, postdocs, and research associates relatively early in their career. And this is the ones that are involved in hydrogen-based research. So we have other thematics that we study in our lab and in other collaborations. And some of those students and early career scientists are here at CU Boulder. Some have been elsewhere, like Montana State University or Colorado School of Mines or Columbia University or the University of Southampton in the UK, because we've tended to have strong collaborative networks, and part of that has been co-mentoring students and trying to make sure that their work will come to fruition as well. So some of them will get highlighted today, but I want to recognize how many have been involved in the story of today. I also want to remember in the very beginning to talk a little bit about some of the primary funding sources for research that I'm going to share. So NASA has been integral. In particular, what was called the NASA Astrobiology Institute. But CU Boulder is intimately connected to NASA in many different research enterprises. But back in 2001, Bruce Jakosky, also in my department, helped lead a 10-department collaborative institute called the NAI, which lasted for 10 years. And then we have many, many faculty across different departments that have continued to do astrobiology research. And in 2015, we started another NAI here, which is the one that Seb mentioned, the Rock Powered Life NAI that I led, which was us and to 9 other institutions. And so this thread has been fundamental to getting a lot of the research done that we've been interested in. At the same time, we've been supported by the Department of Energy, both basic energy sciences, because we're trying to do fundamental research that's important for understanding energy dynamics, as well as RPE, which is a much more applied one that's trying to lead towards commercialization. I'm very happy to be currently by the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. So they have come to CU and helped support us over the past 2 years, and many in helping us to translate our research to help catalyze the development of geologic hydrogen. I'm also need to disclose my conflicts of interest. So as there's this growth of and connection of our research more into industry and into applied realms, in the past few years, I've taken on a variety of roles. One of them is a hydrogen advisor to a clean energy startup company called Eden Geopower. And then I also play a scientific advisory role on the boards of a company called Vima Hydrogen, another startup in this space, and then Renaissance Philanthropy, which is also like Grantham, trying to really help build a collaborative environment and see the success of the birth of this new industry. So we're going to talk about hydrogen today. Turns out in the room, walking in, I got to see Dr. Jeff Ellis, who is a treasure for us here in Boulder, Colorado. He lives here, works for the US Geological Survey, and has been the world ambassador in talking about the discovery and the growth potential of geologic hydrogen globally. He's part of the numerous people that brought me into this area as we started to realize how our fundamental research here could be applied into this field. So what's the big idea? The big idea has been that I think my whole career here at CU has been I want to use hydrogen as a potentially clean energy source rather than, say, fossil fuels. Because hydrogen, when you burn it with oxygen, just produces a clean product like water. However, accessing enough hydrogen, producing enough hydrogen is a challenge. And there have been many different approaches that have been brought online, some of which use fossil hydrocarbons to be the source of generating hydrogen, some of which use clean energy sources or green energy sources like solar and wind to split water hydrogen. And the change that's happening right now is the growing recognition that actually the Earth has always been producing hydrogen. It's a natural byproduct of dynamic geochemical processes on our planet. Has it made enough hydrogen that we could potentially be harnessing this more effectively into the energy sector? What's the scale of hydrogen on our planet that we produce it in ways that might make a difference? So there's a lot going on in this realm. I'm only going to give a brief background into this and jump more into the story of how we even got connected. In general, demand for hydrogen from whatever type of sources is growing quite rapidly. And we're sort of predicted to be at a stage where we'd need a number which is called 500 million metric tons per year by the 2050. Now that's hard to translate necessarily into what does that mean in terms of the amount of energy that you need. But we're really struggling to bring on potential sources of or ways of generating hydrogen anywhere close to that. Geological hydrogen, if we can tap into it, if we can demonstrate that this resource is real or can be engineered, which we'll talk about, could instead become a source of both low-cost hydrogen and low-carbon hydrogen. And so this is where a lot of government and industry interest is coming from at the moment. So to address a variety of energy security and net zero goals, the question has become, like, what can government and industry do to come in and adequately assess whether or not we have what we call a geological hydrogen resource on Earth currently, and what fraction of that could maybe be accessed and tapped and produced to help supply energy, at least over the few hundred years. And one of the things I enjoy about sort of that discovery in geologic hydrogen is that it's extremely geologically diverse or geographically diverse. So we're looking for hydrogen right now on every, in the US, in Canada, and into Alaska, but it's happening in Australia, it's happening in the Philippines, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in the Middle East. As the awareness of the fact that we may have reserves of geologic hydrogen on Earth are growing, we're starting to look almost under every rock in every corner. So venture capital is also very active in this area, trying to make bets on the types of technologies or approaches that may be able to harness this. Where does academia come in right now? In part, we have a huge amount of data from decades of research about systems producing hydrogen, just never believing that it might be at a scale that could be something that was brought into the energy sector. And so there's this conversation that's going on saying, wait, what knowledge do we have that we can use and expand upon to help initiate the best R&D and the fastest R&D to bring this on and have successful geological exploration for these energy resources? Right. So I'm going to use a variety of cartoons for many of my geoscientist friends in the room. I promise there are detailed geophysical, geochemical, geological characterization of some systems. The Pyrenees is a good example right now that's being very intensively studied. But I wanted to bring this cartoon into this discussion today because it's the closest to home. This is where we can imagine Boulder sitting in this picture. So here would be an image where you would have the Front Range, and we could put Boulder close to where it says the Rocky Mountains. And beneath our feet here are layers and layers of rock and strata that have been deposited over time. And below them even is what we would call the basement. And the hard crystalline basement that also makes the core of the Rocky Mountains is on the order of billions of years old. And there's a lot of interest in what's going on, I'm trying to get direction, to the east of us at this point in time, out in Kansas and Nebraska and up in Minnesota into Michigan, because there's areas at depth to the east where there are rocks called the Mid-Continent Rift that were placed again over a very long time period ago that have the potential to react with deeply stored and flowing groundwaters to produce geological hydrogen. That's not a surprise per se that those rocks could potentially have a reaction with water and make hydrogen. There's a variety of mechanisms that could happen, but in this particular case, it would be that iron contained in minerals within those rocks could react with water and reduce that water to hydrogen. That's a production term. The other is that the basement around it can have concentrations of radioactive elements like uranium, potassium, and thorium. And when they undergo radioactive decay, they will split water and produce hydrogen. These are well-known processes of generating hydrogen. So there's a lot of scientific investigation of those, just not necessarily in this geologic context. And geologic context really matters because the question is, how fast and how much hydrogen maybe gets produced through just these two mechanisms, let alone many others? And then when it's produced, what happens to it? Does it stay in place or does it migrate? So in geology terms, we have a source that we believe exists in these systems. Then we don't know if there's migration, but where might the hydrogen migrate to? And it might migrate right up to the surface, enter our atmosphere, and be lost. Or it may migrate short distances and react with other components in the rock or the microbes that live within the pore spaces in that rock and be consumed. And the assumption has been over time that the loss term's so large and hydrogen so labile that we won't necessarily be able to find it. What's changed is that there have been discoveries of hydrogen shows, at least in the subsurface, where there are systems where hydrogen's clearly been produced before and then it's sealed, it's trapped. There's a barrier that's been preventing its loss to the surface. And the question is, how many places do the conditions all come together correctly that maybe allow there to be a significant accumulation of hydrogen as a resource? So a lot of people in the oil and gas industry are migrating to using their approaches to investigate this question, but we need to come back a lot to experimental geochemistry and realms like that because of really understanding the rates of these production terms and how they will vary under different geologic contexts. What I was just describing was what we call natural geologic hydrogen, its production and storage. There is also a lot of interest in sort of taking the same idea. So in this other cartoon, you can see a well, again, tapping into hydrogen trapped underground that's sitting in some type of reservoir. But on the far right of this cartoon, the conceptual idea is that we actually might know enough about the geochemistry of these iron-bearing rich rocks that we could choose to engineer them in a way where we would inject wells into them and we would add the missing term that was never there before to make hydrogen, and that's water. So there was always iron-bearing rock, but if it didn't see water before, it didn't make hydrogen. So it might be storing a huge energy potential within it. And you can liberate it by adding water. And you need to not only add the water, but you need to migrate that water and gas back out, collect that gas, re-inject that water. So how do we engineer those systems, and would it be economically feasible? So that's called engineered and stimulated hydrogen. And we're going to come back to that thematic at the end of this talk, because that's part of where we're going here at CU Boulder. Yeah. So stepping back then, I was saying I want to sort of discuss what I'm going to call basic science, science that we do most of the time day in, day out in our lab, trying to understand Earth and planetary scale processes. In this particular case, we've been studying a reaction called serpentinization. And serpentinization is closely linked to everything that I've mentioned so far before. So on Earth, one of the most abundant minerals and materials is olivine. It's a magnesium iron silicate. It's a rock-forming mineral, and we have a variety of rocks, but the Earth's mantle, so it's a little bit deeper and below the outer crust of our planet, is dominantly composed of minerals like this. So on Earth, or on other rocky bodies in our solar system that are very chemically and mineralogically similar, they again see water. There's a hydration and an oxidation reaction that happens. And it's that hydration and oxidation reaction. It produces serpentine. That's why it's called serpentinization. And hydrogen can be produced if the iron that was released from those minerals got oxidized and reduced the water. And so it's the controls on all these other products here that are forming that can be very important to how much hydrogen did you make, did that reaction proceed. So it's a prevalent process through Earth history. There's been a lot of excitement because there's evidence that this has occurred on the surface of Mars, and that's been part of the reason of where the current Mars mission is located. And then in 2017, the Cassini mission that was looking at Saturn and imaged plumes of vapor that were being emanating from Enceladus's poles and could find hydrogen as one of the molecules that was being released. And that's really exciting because you don't just have hydrogen, again, lingering around. It tends to be indicative of active geological processes, water-rock reaction. So it made Enceladus a target for a place that is potentially geologically active. It's producing energy sources. It has water and energy ingredients for life. Could it be habitable or not? And so it shaped some of these astrobiology discussions that Seb was mentioning. Now on Earth, the most vigorous hydration, serpentinization reactions tend to happen in areas of what we would call high heat flow, where there's a lot of heat. We're having fluid circulation along things like ridge axes, hydrothermal vents are formed. And there's really interesting areas on the seafloor where very hydrogen-rich vents emanate. One of them that's been of great interest for the last 20 years through my time here has been called Lost City hydrothermal vent on the seafloor. And interested in understanding both the reactions that generate hydrogen and the life forms that live in the deep ocean where all that hydrogen comes out. The question we've been trying to ask in my group here at CU, though, through that time has been to say, a lot of our it's not that hot. The temperatures in the upper few kilometers of our crust are sitting below the boiling temperature of water. Are they hot enough to react with water and produce hydrogen? Or is hydrogen reaction suppressed there? Because the question then is, how prevalent is it that hydrogen production is occurring throughout the subsurface? Is it restricted to narrow locations, or is it more extensive than we believe? Now, when you get to these lower temperatures, you can't just study the rock hydrating and reacting with water, because we're also in a temperature regime in which life persists. So below 121 degrees C, we're within the temperature window of life, and any of those systems that may be hydrating and reacting and producing hydrogen could also have microbial life intimately associated with it that's containing the hydrogen at that same time. So what's the dynamic and the net balance of that process that's happening? And we really just haven't had quantitative data, both lab to field, on what could be the rates of hydrogen production. Is it being consumed quickly? What life forms are using that hydrogen? How would we recognize that this is happening now or had happened in the past? And so in these scales here, we're sort of looking, over hundreds of meters to kilometers into the subsurface of the Earth, into fracture zones. So these are fractures that have opened in the rock, but now they've been sealed by new minerals that have formed. So that's all the white that's coming through. But they are alive. So that picture that's on the far right is the conceptual that you can actually pop these rocks open and find microbes living in those pore spaces where water still moves through them. It's a challenging question to start to tackle because experimentally, as well as in the field, you're going to get a lot more hydrogen produced if you work at higher temperatures. And thermodynamically, the predicted yield of hydrogen is higher at high temperatures, like 300 degrees Celsius. Kinetically, it's faster at 300 degrees Celsius. And so Tom McCollum, for example, here, a beautiful experimentalist and theoretical geochemist at LASP, has done sort of world-class work on understanding the dynamics and the transformations that occur in hydrothermal temperatures to minerals like olivine to make hydrogen. But to drop your temperature regime and ask this question, well, how fast and how much hydrogen can you make at 100 or at 50 degrees C is the realm that we've been trying to play in. And at the same time, to then recognize how are we going to study it in the context of the fact that if the mineral, which like for the far right there would be the surface of an olivine, it dissolves, it hydrates, it makes the beautiful serpentine growing in there, how does the life couple into that? And one of the types of organisms we study the most, again, in my lab, are methanogens. And they're organisms that take hydrogen produced from rock water reaction, react it with carbon dioxide if it's present, and then the byproduct's methane. So you're not going to see hydrogen as the key product of these things. Now you're going to see methane as a potential product. And that's just one possible example. And so I don't get to tell a methane story today. It's really hard because we have so many cool methane stories. But we have been trying to understand the limits to which life can do this. How far can, how hot can it be? How little carbon can there be? How high can the pH be? What would it take to stop them from being able to do this? Yeah. Two tools I'm going to throw into some of the scientific discussion today that we use a lot. So arriving here at CU Boulder, I had a lot of training in using national user facilities, things like the Stanford Synchrotron or APS or other places like that. We still go, so some members in the room here have just literally flown home from the Synchrotron. Some of our teams at SSRL right now. Some people that I see in here were trained there. We've really needed Department of Energy facilities like this to be able to come and say, if I'm interested in an element like iron, how am I going to map and find where iron resides in complex geological materials? Find the history of that iron, how it's been mobilized and reacted and changed in chemical forms. And so we both use ways of mapping where iron in different chemical forms may reside. This is actually a sulfur map, so I'm cheating over here. But where an element, we can map elemental distributions, and we can also probe it spectroscopically to ask the question of how much redox chemistries happen, which is part of energy generation that occurs. The other facilities we use here are homegrown, so built here at CU Boulder through financial support provided from the provost and other sources like that. We were able to create a Raman microspectroscopy core facility. It's directed by Eric Ellison, who's here, and managed by Jess Hankins, who I think is here too right now. And so this facility, we benefit from significantly, but it's not for us. It's a broad campus facility, works with a lot of industry campus users to characterize chemical states of different types of matter. What we use it for is, again, to say, we want to look at things at the micron scale. That's the scale of microbial life. And we will take either rock samples or we'll take biomass of the cells that we've collected from somewhere, and we can put it under a microscope. We're using a laser, and we're going to scan across our sample, and as we're scanning across the sample, we'll get a spectrum at every pixel, and we'll get hundreds of thousands of spectra. And then we'll use multivariate statistical approaches to say, tell me what chemical components exist within this. And it's exquisite in the detail, and it can bring out of material transformation. So on the right, for example, what you're seeing is layers and layers of generations of serpentine, but they didn't all form at the same time. And they're just slightly chemically different, and then they can be distinguished on the basis of their spectroscopic fingerprint. Or over here, we'll come back to this later, but we'll look at a microbial cell, and we can probe one cell and the cell next to it and the cell next to it and ask questions about what they've been doing in the environment. Yeah. So a lot of the time that we spend is here in the lab. And I'm just showing the primary drivers of that lab work. They've had many, many assistants and mentees. Usually when they're pulling their hair out and saying, I don't want to do any more of these experiments, and I want someone else to do these experiments. So Lisa Mayhew, shown on the left here, was one of my first two PhD students. And in her thesis, she really did some beautiful work trying to do our first efforts at using, in this case, synchrotron-based approaches to start hydrating rocks and figure out what those initial first incipient reactions are. Was any iron getting oxidized? How much hydrogen was getting made? Could we figure out what about the mineralogy was controlling that process? And she published some nice work, finished her thesis, had left CU, came back at the time we were doing this Rock-Powered Life NAI, and co-mentored Hannah Miller, who was here as a PhD student. And we were all kind of stunned. Lisa generated all this data on how olivine and peridotites, which is this other kind of rock, and other materials make hydrogen. And then Hannah came along and started making a huge amount of hydrogen very fast from new types of rocks that we'd collected from different field systems in Cedars, California, and from Oman. And we're going to come back to talking about Oman later either. And we're like, wait, we thought we understood this. What's going on? How do you get even more hydrogen? These rocks we thought were already been in seawater. So we'll come back to Hannah as well. But at this time, Eric Ellison, who is a research scientist here at CU Boulder to this day, was working with both of them and started to do studies of trying to understand from our spectroscopic work, the controlling reactions on making hydrogen. And I put him in twice. That's the same guy, just in case you're wondering. Just to show, there's actually been a lot of different projects in evolution, and he has pivoted through time in what his roles are in helping us to continue to push and probe what are hydrogen-generating processes and the mechanisms behind them. And now he's pretty happy in the lab to have passed a lot of it on to a postdoc called Valentin Kombedon, who's also at the synchrotron right now, not with us today. And in these, you're using experimental apparatus that either we can purchase or we're using some more affordable ways to kind of quickly screen things or run long-term experiments at low temperatures, and we can get out rates of hydrogen. What we want are predictive frameworks for different systems, and for most of our work, we're really looking at these olivine-dominated ones. The interest in the community now is massive across more rock types than that. But what we learned at the highest level was that rocks that had seen water already were more prone to generating hydrogen than fresh ones. And it took us a while to puzzle over that and figure it out. The short version of the story is that if you take a rock like this, which has seen a lot of water, and we call it like 50% serpentinized, it's still half reacted, and half hasn't gone yet. A lot of the iron that sits in the primary original mineral olivine came out. It came out, dissolved into the water, and then it went back into a new mineral, but that new mineral locked it in still as iron too, just now in a hydroxide form. And that's called brucite. And this stuff accumulates in the variety of rocks that we study. And it's not until later, when the fluid dynamics and the geochemistry of the system changes, that the brucite finally reacts out, and then a huge flux of hydrogen is yielded. And what's important here is now we're writing new reactions or different reactions for the hydrogen generation. It changes the thermodynamics, it changes the predictions of how much hydrogen. And through time, that our hunt for what are the key reactions controlling hydrogen has continued to evolve. So these rocks came from real field systems. Like I said, Cedars in California are from Oman. And while Hannah was a PhD student, we wanted to go to the place those rocks came from and try to understand them in their geologic context and to figure out if that also could inform us on how they were such good hydrogen generators. We also knew from both our own field trips and published work, in Oman you can go find these places like this, which is a hyperalkaline spring, and find water that's come up from the deep subsurface. And it is sitting here, highly reacted. It's what we call pH 11. It's got little bits of bubbling coming up. You can collect those gases. It has hydrogen and methane, but it is not hydrothermal. It is not hot. This water is sitting here at 30 to 40 degrees C. So processes, again, in the lower temperature regime seem to be producing hydrogen at field scale. When you go to Oman in the ophiolite, the scale is really hard to convey. So right here in these images right here, we're just standing in one bit looking out at what is called the center of the universe when you're standing there from Peter Kellerman that we work with. And you look and you just keep turning, and everywhere you look are more and more of these olivine-rich mantle rocks that have been brought up to Earth's surface through a process called abduction. And you can see how dry it is. We're in this desert environment. Water resources are scarce. And we've been very fortunate that in Oman, the Ministry of Water Resources had drilled many wells, hundreds, often 300 meters or so, into these rocks to see if they stored any water, and they do. So all the wells are full up to 20 meters below land surface, and they contain water, and sometimes that water is potable water. You can use it for drinking water, you can use it for agriculture. But other times, the water is nasty. It's pH 11 and it's gassy. And we smile and we go, where's the gassy water? And so we both help to find the good water. And then when we find the gassy water, we deploy a variety of different kinds of equipment into place so that we can go down and profile over that depth into those wells and try to understand where geochemical gradients have been established and what's happening in the subsurface to produce this gas. In 2018, we here at CU Boulder and with our team with the Rock Powered Life NAI were part of the Oman drilling project. That was a large international project that was targeted to drill into rocks that were actively serpentinizing. So not a fossil system, but where we knew that groundwater was moving through the rocks reacting today. Could we come catch the reactions happening in real time? And we wanted to be able to collect the rocks themselves too, and not have them be from an old core repository, but freshly brought out so we could investigate them for the microbial life that lived within them through the ways that we collected them. And so we wanted to come back and say again, back in the real world environment, are these rocks fertile for hydrogen production? Do they still have capacity? They're already highly reacted. Look at all those textures that are there. A lot of water's passed through them. Are they spent, or can they make more hydrogen? And who's living in those rocks that maybe is part of the dynamic of consuming hydrogen as it's produced? So we use the Raman lab a lot. This image on the left is just one of my favorite because, again, you can just see generation. This is how geologists look at things. There's layers going this way where new minerals formed, and then we've broken it open, and then layers going this way where new minerals are growing in, and then that red stuff in the middle is the youngest thing that's formed. But there's generation of process, and there's a lot of chemical, in the end, actually biological information preserved in these materials that we're hunting for. Molecules that stay there that tell us about how the reactions happened and what, if there was organisms there, like parts of their bodies that got left behind. But what we're trying to do is get these images of, again, at this micron scale, what are all those materials in those different colors? And at the synchrotron, then you map the same area, but you ask, is iron 2 plus or iron 3 plus? You want to know what oxidation state. 2 plus, the green, is the original. And if it's still green, no redox reactions happened. If it's red, it's reacted at some point and made iron 3. But what we want to know is, like, what was the product? Like, what minerals were made? Because we have to, again, write the reactions out and figure out their thermodynamics. It's all part of how we predict where this will happen elsewhere, how much hydrogen will be made, start to investigate the right kinetics. We need to really have a quantitative image of those things, so we use those approaches. Okay, so let's change gears. I'm going to just briefly comment then on the life component, because we've done so much work on that part, it's almost impossible to corral it. But one of the ideas that I want you to keep in your mind is that when we go into the subsurface of the Earth, water's stored and moved through the rocks that we encounter. Where water moves, life moves. And so as fractures are open, there's little microbial cells that are present, and they're moving with that. But they also can stay in the rock matrix. And so they're still living and still viable and functioning in what we call mineralized veins and sealed fractures and things like that. And so the challenge been trying to address is that if we can pump water out of a well and pull some of these guys up with the water, but we often can't get to what's living in all the rest of it unless we pull the rock up too. And we've needed both to investigate it. Whether you pull up the water or you pull up the rock, there's cells everywhere. So the microbial life is abundant, and it's usually 100,000 cells up to 1 million cells per milliliter of fluid that we're bringing up. So it's chock loaded, and this is a big cluster we popped out of a rock when we broke it open with a chisel and a hammer. So that's a whole cluster of cells. And what we're trying to study then is the fact that one of the dominant metabolisms that they use to get chemical energy and survive is to eat hydrogen. So as the hydrogen's being made, they eat that, and they need to breathe something down there. To get any energy, they have to connect that hydrogen to a reaction with these other options here. I'm going to give you carbon dioxide if it's in the water, sulfate or nitrate, which are salts, or maybe some iron in the rock itself. And it gives rise to a variety of possible metabolisms that we're probing, called methane, methanogenesis, where we might make acetate or we make sulfide. They all have different chemical byproducts at the end. So the net chemistry changes significantly depending on how the microbes eat the hydrogen, what they produce on the backside. It changes the rock, it changes what fluxes to the atmosphere. And we want to know not only what metabolisms they use, but do they just go really slow and just take a little nibble of the hydrogen as they live? Or are they gobbling it all up, which is sort of the current fear in the geologic hydrogen world, is that you're never going to beat the microbes. So the question we're asking right now, I'm skipping now a decade of work and leaping forward past all of their theses, so I apologize if any of them are in the room right now, and I'm embarrassed. But I want to just say that where we are today, because we do want to be able to help de-risk this for industry, is when microbes are presented with hydrogen, depending on the subsurface environment, how fast do they go? And how do we start to make models that'll predict whether hydrogen gets conserved or is lost? And this figure from a review paper that we'd written before we were starting this work, we're trying to look at the fact that if you're looking at cultures that many, like if you were to go over to BioFrontiers lab or something, they're gonna grow things that are growing on the order of hours. And in our lab, we work with things that go much slower. Still, cultures tend to be doubling themselves over the order of maybe slowly at days. But back in the natural environment, in soils or in deep sea sediments or in environments that have been probed, the timescales for a cell to turn over and replicate itself could be on the order of years to decadal or century scale. So what is it in these kinds of environments that we're looking at? So just as you can't hear it, but this is really low key, I don't know what to call it, when you don't have the equipment you want in the field and you gotta figure out what to do. So I wanted a really nice camera, downhole camera, I don't own one. But I had a GoPro, and I had a flashlight that was waterproof and duct tape. And we were going down, and you're banging on the side of the thing as I take a fishing line. And we're banging on the side, but you're looking down these wells. And do you see the little flocks and the particles? Like as you're going, the little white stuff in these things. So we've gone maybe 20 meters into a well, but we're gonna go another Eiffel Tower's worth deep and collect samples down there and then use those to start studying them. And they're in a geochemical state that has no influence from the atmosphere. Atmosphere got scrubbed out by now already. And so Tristan Caro, who's recently graduated and is at Caltech right now, and Shrishti Kashyap, who's a research associate here at the moment, are busy publishing out a bunch of work they did where in 2023, Tristan and I went back to Oman and took more sophisticated samplers, but lowered them down a hole still manually and pulling them back up, and set up a variety of experiments, and Shrishti's one will be highlighted here, where what she did is took the groundwater with the microbes that were in it, fed them a lot of hydrogen, like they see in the subsurface or can see in the subsurface, but added to the water what was called deuterated water. And the deuterium, it's D2O instead of H2O. And she can control what strength of the label she put in and how long she incubates them for. And she and Tristan together have done this to create they've written a paper, which I don't get to get into, where they've figured out a quantitative way to figure out how fast are the cells turning over, depending on the rate at which they incorporate this label into the proteins, lipids in their cells. And the way we probe it is the Raman lab. So this is where we've really moved in the last 2 or 3 years to using this significantly for a quantitative stable isotope tracing method, where the general concept is that's a spectrum of a single microbial cell, and if the cell is growing and turning over in the presence of this deuterated water, it will incorporate the deuterium into its, make carbon deuterium bonds in its lipids and proteins instead of carbon hydrogen bonds. And a carbon deuterium bond shows up here in these areas where it's labeled in a silent part of the spectrum. So if it'll stay silent if they're not active, but the more active they are, and there's ways to calibrate this, then you'll see that signal grow in. And from that, in some of the work, what is most remarkable so far has been the data is telling us that cells are growing really, really quite quickly for a subsurface ecosystem. The cells under more clement conditions that have some nice carbon dioxide and the pH is only 7 or 8 might turn over on the order of 9, 10, 12 days. If you start to stress them pretty hard and you put the pH up above 11 and you don't have any CO2 or other oxidants to react that hydrogen with, then it starts to really slow down, and those turnover rates, as we call them, might stand out now into hundreds of days. But it's really giving us a first quantitative view of how fast this life is functioning down there and giving us data that we need to then figure out the volume of hydrogen they're consuming associated with that activity. So the final phase of this talk, there's just a few minutes of that, is that one, we feel like we've been able to do a huge amount of work in the upper green type of top 300 to 400 meters. We have had wells drilled or accessed. We've got rocks and fluids back. We understand a lot about mineralogical changes, chemical changes, biological activity. And microbes are very, very active, and you really have a hard time sniffing a lot of hydrogen out in these shallower regimes because the microbial activity is so fast. But what about deeper than that? So in these darker areas here, a lot less water migrates through. And there's the potential there that there's a lot of rock that's even more fertile for hydrogen generation, could make future hydrogen, and is not that microbially inhabited, and or the microbes are maybe not that adapted yet to hydrogen. And this is where in 2022, going to 2023, as we learned that there was a lot of interest in both finding natural reserves of hydrogen or maybe creating them, we realized that we have so much data in this system in Oman to frame that kind of investigation. If you're going to ask the question of whether you could actually produce new hydrogen from these kinds of rocks, let's test it here where we already know a lot about what's occurring naturally. How much could you change and engineer it? So that's the basis of the Rock Hydrogen Project. It started here in 2023. We're leading it out of CU Boulder, and we have several partners in Australia, US, and France. And the key thing that we're trying to say is, if this idea has any merit, and there's a lot of questions about whether stimulated geologic hydrogen could be economically feasible or environmentally appropriate, like can we design that well? We need a way to go to pilot as fast as possible and test how fast hydrogen we can make, what's controlling the net rate of hydrogen production, because it's going to be a balance of chemical and biological processes. What volumes can you really stimulate, and can you imagine engineering it to a state where it'd be economic and worth doing? So thanks to Eric Parrish, who is part of a program here to help create artwork when you're putting proposals together, and I use this artwork all the time now. But that's the design of what we have started. We're not all the way there yet, but what we're trying to do is come back to these locations that we know well. We needed to get permitted in Oman to do this, and we have that permit now, and we're trying to move to having what we call an injection well, go way deeper than we've been working previously, pass those fluids through those rocks, react them in that, and extract it to the surface, strip that hydrogen, and recirculate that fluid. And what are all the technical challenges with doing that, and how do we do really robust scientific investigation on that and assess what those technical challenges will be? So this is March 2025. We are in pilot phase. So we really have tried to move as fast as we could. And it doesn't look that exciting right there at the moment. You're like, okay. Level little lab that's sitting right here, but right by that vehicle, there's a wellhead, and that well is drilled a kilometer tight, which is a whole new frontier for us in terms of looking at these depths and into these rocks and understanding what their mineralogy is, if there's any water there, and what microbial life might exist. And when we were there, we were able to just sip into the top parts of this. We didn't have the right equipment yet to sample deeper, but we were getting hints that this looked really interesting. What have we been doing there? Well, it's just a single well. So here are the cartoons modified. We're really just one well on the surface, but we haven't injected water. So we're working with a partner, 4401. It's a carbon mineralization company in Oman. They've been excellent to work with, and they were working to help test how could you even inject water into these rocks. And we could, so that was very fortunate. So we could inject water into naturally existing fractures that are present here. And we put a large volume of water in and went deeper than 900 meters, and then called shut it in, walk away, and then come back when you're ready to do something with it and measure it and characterize it. And so that's what we just did 3 weeks ago. So now we're in October of 2025. Same well, but now what we're doing is not pushing water in, we're pulling water out. And so now we have a lot of trucks and activity because we're trying to collect that water and dispose of it carefully, make sure we're managing all aspects of sort of how water's been handling. And while we're doing it, we're collecting water, measuring the dynamics of how much gas may or may not have been produced through a year of reaction into the subsurface, characterize the microbiology of anyone that might be present in those fluids we're bringing back against the water that went in, collecting noble gases to and other things to age date and figure out origins and sources of the fluids. So it's been a very intensive sort of effort of building up that field work, but spectacularly exciting as we've been going. And so This was a video that I presented publicly for the first time on Friday last week and to an international audience to say we're in pilot phase, we've injected water, we reacted it for a year. We didn't know if we could pump back. We could pump back. And as we were pumping back, we just have a river, or I called it the hydrogen highway, I think, while we were there in the field. A lot of gas. We're bringing back a lot of gas. And that gas is dominated by hydrogen. It's not pure hydrogen. It has nitrogen and a small amount of methane that's present in it. But we're going. And we weren't even prepared for the volumes of both water or gas that we were going to see there. So we're extremely excited. We also have a huge, huge amount of work to do to figure out what happened during those reactions and how to design those next experiments. So we're moving on to try and move to that bigger vision of creating a system that looks like a pilot towards something that someone could commercialize. And we do need to bring in other partners that are helping us to monitor and optimize so many aspects of this system. And we're doing this in Oman, but there's a lot of interest globally in this process. And pilots in North America will be beginning in 2026 through some of these other startup companies. And we are trying to share the knowledge that we're gleaning because we're trying to help the field rather than be highly proprietary about it. So thanks, it took me a little bit longer than I wanted it to. I got to acknowledge many of these key sponsors before, but I want to just bring up Oman Drilling Project was essential. We have to partner well with the Ministry of Energy and Minerals, and we're working really closely right now with 4401. The two other acknowledgments I'd like to make before people can run for the doors at the 5 o'clock hour, and I won't be offended, so thank you so much for staying this long, but most of what I talked about, it's probably happened in the last decade, but some of it started earlier. And I can't really stress the number of people you have to pull into play to make this stuff happen. And so day to day, it's like, who are our lab group, our collaborators? But I'm just going to focus on CU for a moment. So I put in blue what I call the names of the sub-organizations that we're relying on at different times, and then the names of a lot of the people that fill my email inbox, and I fill their email inbox, and we've communicated over years might have only met each other recently. But when it comes down to not only working within arts and sciences, but with Rio, with, again, OCG in particular, I mean, there's so much work to build these relationships, contracts, and give us access to that. And so huge, huge amount of time and effort to do that. So I just want to say thank you to many of the people that just do this fundamental work. And when in a day and an age where people question things about, for example, the overhead rates at universities and the rest, it's not just the labs I have and the department and the facilities, but the ecosystem that you need to work in and to be able to make all of this function. And it's very deep and broad. So thank you. And lastly, oh, well, that's Niels, you cut me off before I got to say thank you. No, that's good. You should cut me off, though. But I want to say, too, I really enjoyed the community here. So I have several friends here today. I did not put pictures of you up to embarrass you in all the places that we've hung out and had fun. But I do have my colleagues here. So we just had a Geological Sciences Department retreat recently. This is one of the current iterations of the lab group. It changes all the time. So again, please, for those of you here, just think of this as inclusive of those that have been present recently. I am very lucky to have not only my immediate family, but a lot of extended family here in Colorado. It happened when we moved here and took positions at CU that we also had brothers and now sisters and mothers and fathers and uncles and et cetera that are all here, and we get to spend special time together, and some of them are here today. And then often, again, these field teams in these groups. So it's this constant dynamic of building and seeing these teams mature and grow and people disperse, and I'm really thankful for that. So thanks for your patience. I'm really glad you're here today. And I'll take any questions for anyone that can stay. You should definitely eat food before you go.